called him Moshe the Beetle, as if his entire life he had never had a surname. He was the jack of all trades in a Hasidic house of prayer, a shtibel. The Jews of Sayet, the little town in Transylvania where I spent my childhood, were fond of him. He was poor and lived in utter penury. As a rule, our townspeople, while they did help the needy, did not particularly like them. Moshe the Beetle was the exception. He stayed out of people's way. His presence bothered no one. He had mastered the art of rendering himself insignificant, invisible. Physically, he was as awkward as a clown. His waif-like shyness made people smile. As for me, I liked his wide, dreamy eyes, gazing off into the distance. He spoke little. He sang, or rather he chanted, and the few snatches I caught here and there spoke of divine suffering, of the Shekinah in exile, where, according to Kabbalah, it awaits its redemption linked to that of man. I met him in 1941. I was almost 13 and deeply observant. By day I studied Talmud, and by night I would run to the synagogue to weep over the destruction of the temple. One day I asked my father to find me a master who could guide me in my studies of Kabbalah. "You are too young for that. Maimonides tells us that one must be 30 before venturing into the world of mysticism, a world fraught with peril. First, you must study the basic subjects, those you are able to comprehend." My father was a cultured man, rather unsentimental. He rarely displayed his feelings, not even within his family, and was more involved with the welfare of others than with that of his own kin. The Jewish community of Sayet held him in highest esteem. His advice on public and even private matters was frequently sought. There were 4 of us children, Hilda, the eldest, then Bee. I was the third and the only son. Zipporah was the youngest. My parents ran a store. Hilda and Bee helped with the work. As for me, my place was in the house of study, or so they said. "There are no Kabbalists in Sayet," my father would often tell me. He wanted to drive the idea of studying Kabbalah from my mind. In vain. I succeeded on my own in finding a master for myself in the person of Moshe the Beetle. He had watched me one day as I prayed at dusk. "Why do you cry when you pray?" he asked, as though he knew me well. "I don't know," I answered, troubled. I had never asked myself that question. I cried because something inside me felt the need to cry. That was all I knew. "Why do you pray?" he asked after a moment. Why did I pray? Strange question. Why did I live? Why did I breathe? "I don't know," I told him, even more troubled and ill at ease. "I don't know." From that day on, I saw him often. He explained to me, with great emphasis, that every question possessed a power that was lost in the answer. Man comes closer to God through the questions he asks him, he liked to say. Therein lies true dialogue. Man asks, and God replies. But we don't understand his replies. We cannot understand them, because they dwell in the depths of our souls and remain there until we die. The real answers, Eliezer, you will find only within yourself. "And why do you pray, Moshe?" I asked him. "I pray to the God within me for the strength to ask him the real questions." We spoke that way almost every evening, remaining in the synagogue, long after all the faithful had gone, sitting in the semi-darkness where only a few half-burnt candles provided a flickering light. One evening I told him how unhappy I was not to be able to find in Sayet a master to teach me the Zohar, the Kabbalistic works, the secrets of Jewish mysticism. He smiled indulgently. After a long silence, he said, "There are 1,001 gates allowing entry into the orchard of mystical truth. Every human being has his own gate." He must not err and wish to enter the orchard through a gate other than his own. That would present a danger not only for the one entering, but also for those who are already inside. And Moshe the Beetle, the poorest of the poor in Sayet, spoke to me for hours on end about the Kabbalah's revelations and its mysteries. Thus began my initiation. Together we would read over and over again the same page of the Zohar, not to learn it by heart, but to discover within the very essence of divinity. And in the course of those evenings I became convinced that Moshe the Beetle would help me enter eternity, into that time when question and answer would become one. And then, one day, all foreign Jews were expelled from Sayet, and Moshe the Beetle was a foreigner. Crammed into cattle cars by the Hungarian police, they cried silently. Standing on the station platform, we too were crying. The train disappeared over the horizon. All that was left was thick, dirty smoke. Behind me, someone said, sighing, "What do you expect? That's war." The deportees were quickly forgotten. A few days after they left, it was rumored that they were in Galicia, working, and even that they were content with their fate. Days went by, then weeks and months. Life was normal again. A calm, reassuring wind blew through our homes. The shopkeepers were doing good business. The students lived among their books, and the children played in the streets. One day, as I was about to enter the synagogue, I saw Moshe the Beetle sitting on a bench near the entrance. He told me what had happened to him and his companions. The train with the deportees had crossed the Hungarian border, and, once in Polish territory, had been taken over by the Gestapo. The train had stopped. The Jews were ordered to get off and onto waiting trucks. The trucks headed toward a forest. There, everybody was ordered to get out. They were forced to dig huge trenches. When they had finished their work, the men from the Gestapo began theirs. Without passion or haste, they shot their prisoners, who were forced to approach the trench one by one and offer their necks. Infants were tossed into the air and used as targets for the machine guns. This took place in the Galician forest near Colomé. How had he, Moshe the Beetle, been able to escape? By a miracle. He was wounded in the leg and left for dead. Day after day, night after night, he went from one Jewish house to the next, telling his story and that of Malka, the young girl who lay dying for 3 days, and that of Toby, the tailor who begged to die before his sons were killed. Moshe was not the same. The joy in his eyes was gone. He no longer sang. He no longer mentioned either God or Kabbalah. He spoke only of what he had seen. But people not only refused to believe his tales, they refused to listen. Some even insinuated that he only wanted their pity, that he was imagining things. Others flatly said that he had gone mad. As for Moshe, he wept and pleaded, "Jews, listen to me. That's all I ask of you. No money, no pity, just listen to me." He kept shouting in synagogue, between the prayer at dusk and the evening prayer. Even I did not believe him. I often sat with him after services and listened to his tales, trying to understand his grief, but all I felt was pity. "They think I'm mad," he whispered, and tears, like drops of wax, flowed from his eyes. Once I asked him the question, "Why do you want people to believe you so much? In your place, I would not care whether they believed me or not." He closed his eyes as if to escape time. "You don't understand," he said in despair. "You cannot understand. I was saved miraculously. I succeeded in coming back. Where did I get my strength? I wanted to return to Sayet to describe to you my death so that you might ready yourselves while there is still time. Life? I no longer care to live. I am alone. But I wanted to come back to warn you. Only no one is listening to me." This was toward the end of 1942. Thereafter, life seemed normal again. London radio, which we listened to every evening, announced encouraging news. The daily bombings of Germany and Stalingrad, the preparation of the Second Front, and so we, the Jews of Sayet, waited for better days that surely were soon to come. I continued to devote myself to my studies, Talmud during the day and Kabbalah at night. My father took care of his business in the community. My grandfather came to spend Rosh Hashanah with us so as to attend the services of the celebrated Rebbe of Borscht. My mother was beginning to think it was high time to find an appropriate match for Hilda. Thus passed the year 1943. Spring 1944. Splendid news from the Russian front. There could no longer be any doubt Germany would be defeated. It was only a matter of time, months or weeks perhaps. The trees were in bloom. It was a year like so many others, with its spring, its engagements, its weddings, and its births. The people were saying, "The Red Army is advancing with giant strides. Hitler will not be able to harm us, even if he wants to." Yes, we even doubted his resolve to exterminate us. Annihilate an entire people? Wipe out a population dispersed through so many nations? So many millions of people? By what means? In the middle of the 20th century? And thus my elders concerned themselves with all manner of things. Strategy, diplomacy, politics, and Zionism, but not with their own fate. Even Moshe the Beetle had fallen silent. He was weary of talking. He would drift through synagogue or through the streets, hunched over, eyes cast down, avoiding people's gaze. In those days, it was still possible to buy immigration certificates to Palestine. I had asked my father to sell everything, to liquidate everything, and to leave. "I'm too old, my son," he answered. "Too old to start a new life. Too old to start from scratch in some distant land." Budapest radio announced that the fascist party had seized power. The regent, Miklos Horthy, was forced to ask a leader of the pro-Nazi Nihilist party to form a new government. Yet we still were not worried. Of course we had heard of the fascists, but it was all in the abstract. It meant nothing more to us than a change of ministry. The next day brought really disquieting news. German troops had penetrated Hungarian territory with the government's approval. Finally, people began to worry in earnest. One of my friends, Moshe Chaim Berkowitz, returned from the capital for Passover and told us, "The Jews of Budapest live in an atmosphere of fear and terror. Anti-Semitic acts take place every day in the streets, on the trains. The fascists attack Jewish stores, synagogues. The situation is becoming very serious." The news spread through Sayet like wildfire. Soon that was all people talked about. But not for long. Optimism soon revived. The Germans will not come this far. They will stay in Budapest. For strategic reasons. For political reasons. In less than 3 days, German army vehicles made their appearance on our streets. Anguish. German soldiers, with their steel helmets and their death's head emblem. Still, our first impressions of the Germans were rather reassuring. The officers were billeted in private homes, even in Jewish homes. Their attitude toward their hosts was distant but polite. They never demanded the impossible, made no offensive remarks, and sometimes even smiled at the lady of the house. A German officer lodged in the Khan's house across the street from us. We were told he was a charming man, calm, likable, and polite. 3 days after he moved in, he brought Miss Khan a box of chocolates. The optimists were jubilant. "Well, what did we tell you? You wouldn't believe us. There they are, your Germans. What do you say now? Where is their famous cruelty?" The Germans were already in our town. The fascists were already in power. The verdict was already out, and the Jews of Sayet were still smiling. the 8 days of Passover. The weather was sublime. My mother was busy in the kitchen. The synagogues were no longer open. People gathered in private homes. No need to provoke the Germans. Almost every rabbi's home became a house of prayer. We drank, we ate, we sang. The Bible commands us to rejoice during the 8 days of celebration, but our hearts were not in it. We wished the holiday would end so as not to have to pretend. On the 7th day of Passover, the curtain finally rose. The Germans arrested the leaders of the Jewish community. From that moment on, everything happened very quickly. The race toward death had begun. First edict. Jews were prohibited from leaving their residences for 3 days, under penalty of death. Moshe the beadle came running to our house. "I warned you!" he shouted, and left without waiting for a response. The same day, the Hungarian police burst into every Jewish home in town. A Jew was henceforth forbidden to own gold, jewelry, or any valuables. Everything had to be handed over to the authorities under penalty of death. My father went down to the cellar and buried our savings. As for my mother, she went on tending to the many chores in the house. Sometimes she would stop and gaze at us in silence. 3 days later, a new decree. Every Jew had to wear the yellow star. Some prominent members of the community came to consult with my father, who had connections at the upper levels of the Hungarian police. They wanted to know what he thought of the situation. My father's view was that it was not all bleak, or perhaps he just did not want to discourage the others, to throw salt on their wounds. The yellow star? So what? It's not lethal. Poor father. Of what then did you die? But new edicts were already being issued. We no longer had the right to frequent restaurants or cafes, to travel by rail, to attend synagogue, to be on the streets after 6 o'clock in the evening. Then came the ghettos. 2 ghettos were created in Sayet. A large one in the center of town occupied 4 streets, and another smaller one extended over several alleyways on the outskirts of town. The street we lived on, Serpent Street, was in the first ghetto. We therefore could remain in our house. But, as it occupied a corner, the windows facing the street outside the ghetto had to be sealed. We gave some of our rooms to relatives who had been driven out of their homes. Little by little, life returned to normal. The barbed wire that encircled us was like a wall, did not fill us with real fear. In fact, we felt that this was not a bad thing. We were entirely among ourselves, a small Jewish republic. A Jewish council was appointed, as well as a Jewish police force, a welfare agency, a labor committee, a health agency, a whole governmental apparatus. People thought this was a good thing. We would no longer have to look at all those hostile faces, endure those hate-filled stares. No more fear, no more anguish. We would live among Jews, among brothers. Of course, there were still unpleasant moments. Every day, the Germans came looking for men to load coal into the military trains. Volunteers for this kind of work were few. But apart from that, the atmosphere was oddly peaceful and reassuring. Most people thought that we would remain in the ghetto until the end of the war, until the arrival of the Red Army. Afterward, everything would be as before. The ghetto was ruled by neither German nor Jew. It was ruled by delusion. Some 2 weeks before Shavuot, a sunny spring day, people strolled seemingly carefree through the crowded streets. They exchanged careful greetings. Children played games, rolling hazelnuts on the sidewalks. Some schoolmates and I were in Ezra Malick's garden studying a Talmudic treatise. Night fell. Some 20 people had gathered in our courtyard. My father was sharing some anecdotes and holding forth on his opinion of the situation. He was a good storyteller. Suddenly the gate opened, and Stern, a former shopkeeper who was now a policeman, entered and took my father aside. Despite the growing darkness, I could see my father turn pale. "What's wrong?" we asked. "I don't know. I have been summoned to a special meeting of the council. Something must have happened." The story he had interrupted would remain unfinished. "I'm going right now," he said. "I'll return as soon as possible. I'll tell you everything. Wait for me." We were ready to wait as long as necessary. The courtyard turned into something like an antechamber into an operating room. We stood, waiting for the door to open. Neighbors, hearing the rumors, had joined us. We stared at our watches. Time had slowed down. What was the meaning of such a long session? "I have a bad feeling," said my mother. "This afternoon I saw new faces in the ghetto. 2 German officers. I believe they were Gestapo. Since we've been here, we have not seen a single officer." It was close to midnight. Nobody felt like going to sleep, though some people briefly went to check on their homes. Others left, but asked to be called as soon as my father returned. At last the door opened and he appeared. His face was drained of color. He was quickly surrounded. Tell us what's happening! Say something!" At that moment, we were so anxious to hear something encouraging, a few words telling us that there was nothing to worry about, that the meeting had been routine, just a review of welfare and health problems. But one glance at my father's face left no doubt. "The news is terrible," he said at last, and then one word: transports. The ghetto was to be liquidated entirely. Departures were to take place street by street, starting the next day. We wanted to know everything, every detail. We were stunned, yet we wanted to fully absorb the bitter news. "Where will they take us?" That was a secret for all, except one, the president of the Jewish Council. But he would not tell, or could not tell. The Gestapo had threatened to shoot him if he talked. "There are rumors," my father said, his voice breaking, "that we are being taken somewhere in Hungary to work in the brick factories. It seems that here we are too close to the front." After a moment's silence, he added, "Each of us will be allowed to bring his personal belongings. A backpack, some food, a few items of clothing. Nothing else." Again, heavy silence. "Go and wake the neighbors," said my father. "They must get ready." The shadows around me roused themselves as if from a deep sleep and left silently in every direction. For a moment we remained alone. Suddenly, Batea Reich, a relative who lived with us, entered the room. "Someone is knocking at the sealed window, the one that faces outside." It was only after the war that I found out who had knocked that night. It was an inspector of the Hungarian police, a friend of my father's. Before we entered the ghetto, he had told us, "Don't worry, I'll warn you if there's danger." Had he been able to speak to us that night, we might still have been able to flee. But by the time we succeeded in opening the window, it was too late. There was nobody outside.